Chapter 71, The Last Building Slot. The last building slot set her up for a bad case of analysis paralysis. She was deciding between the armory, LV1, and the warehouse, LV1. Both options had their pros and cons, and she was a little confused as to which one she should build. She turned around to look at the people who had been following her around as she set up the buildings, staring around in childlike wonder. This was understandable, as seeing edifices slowly materialize, speck by speck, from the ground up within a day was indeed a miraculous sight. She reckoned if there was popcorn, they would have consumed several buckets by now. "I need your opinion on something," she asked after clearing her throat, catching their attention. "Yes, boss, anything," they said, obviously very excited about anything territory-related. "I have one more building slot to fill up and I'm ambivalent between two options," she told them. "I'm torn between Armory LV1 and Warehouse LV1, she said, and then she directly stated some of the pros and cons of each one. The others were also confused and conflicted. For better or for worse, only armor makers could create defense equipment effective against monsters. Their leather clothing from Terran, created by advanced science, could not compare. Althea mused it must have to do with some local elements they didn't know, similar to how a set of bows and arrows could be more effective than a gun. In any case, this was basically a choice between additional defense for an individual and something that would bring great convenience and advantages to the territory administration. Sheila shut her eyes and pursed her lips, thinking, defense was good, but the warehouse was also good. Harold, as a housekeeper, and thus had a bit of bias towards the warehouse. However, he was also very aware of the merits of the armory instead. Knowing he wouldn't be able to provide a smart argument, he opted not to speak for now. It was Eugene who said his piece first. The armory is good, but it only produces level E equipment for now. They were all relatively high level compared to the monsters here, not to mention the huge wall that protected them. The convenience of the warehouse, on the other hand, is very high. Not only would Boss have additional space, with a fresh-keeping function, but Boss could also use this in attacking and defending. Althea agreed. Leaving aside the huge space, there were plenty of other functions that could have if used well. For instance, making a piece of slab appear in front as a shield. For instance, storing a boulder and throwing it over a person's head. She had long wanted to do so, as early as when she was just dealing with zombies. Sadly, the space wasn't big enough at the time. In the end, she just needed a second opinion, because people's instinctive choice was to fully equip themselves before any convenience. The other two saw his point and nodded in agreement. Althea opened her Lord panel again and decided to choose to build a warehouse, LV1. She felt a sense of satisfaction in finally utilizing the system to her level, perhaps even beyond it. In fact, there was also another consideration on her part in choosing the warehouse. That was, to use the warehouse to store stones and wood that was larger than her cap. The fact that level 4 walls weren't locked when its full use requirement exceeded the level cap gave her an idea. Don't say people would simply not build around the entire territory. Althea just thought there must be a way around it. As for the existing vegetation, she decided to keep as much as possible to take advantage of the resource refresh. Since she could not move the trees or buildings, she could only maximize their existence as they were. As for the resources, except for the loose stone and twigs, the rest would be charged, but only very little, just enough for people not to think they could take the resources for granted. For now, she was planning to set a very negligible price of 1 copper per half a kilogram of edible food plant, but with limited QTY, a half kg per person per day. When the population grew, this price would also increase a bit, but this was an issue for later. Anyway, this would ensure people would have enough food, but at the same time safeguarding the interests of the other citizens, and of course, the territory itself. Similarly, water could also be taken from the lake, or the stream for 5 copper per bucket. At the very least, the system gave her the convenience of setting up charge points, so she didn't have to watch every resource point, it would watch itself. To some, in her territory, a person would be able to decently meet their basic needs, with 30 coppers per day. She then turned her attention to Harold, which made the old man straighten up his back. "I need you to open a restaurant for me," she said, pointing at one of the mixed-use buildings along the road. "You will provide relatively affordable food to the masses. It doesn't have to be too fancy, but definitely offers much better food than the system restaurant. No problem, boss, Harold said, confident. Even when the ingredients were limited, the rival establishment, in comparison, was a really low standard to beat. I will give you 10% of the profit, and when you finish paying your debt, I'll give you 50%. Harold stared at her, as if confirming she had actually said so. When she repeated her words, a bit slower, the old man's expression brightened, and he nodded successively. This type of business fitted his heart and passion very well. He would definitely do well. Althea smiled at the simmering enjoy old man and turned to the dark-skinned Eugene, who was watching on in interest. I'll need you for personal use. We have a lot to do. Eugene nodded, honored by her trust. Since working with the boss on the custom house, he had gained a new sort of admiration for her professional worship. Yes, boss. She smiled and finally turned to Sheila. Would you temporarily be able to handle a clinic? I'll supply the medicines. I'd be glad to. Temporarily, until we find a good person to watch the shop. I'm hoping to have you as a correspondent for health concerns in the territory. Sheila was touched by her trust. I'll do my best, and I will also look for good doctors to assist us as well. Althea smiled. It was really great to have reliable partners. Alas, she just missed her husband again. Chapter 72, Farm Villas. None of them noticed the very subtle mood of wistfulness that passed by their boss' eyes, hyper-focused on their new tasks at hand. Sheila grinned, then scooted closer to her, looking around the themed houses near them with shining eyes. So, where are we going to live? Later. This made her pause. She hadn't really thought about it yet, in the sense that she was just copy and pasting the module as she saw fit. She looked at the custom houses that were definitely hundreds of times better than those in royal territory, and wondered the answer to the nurse's question. Each module had good bedrooms, though no beds yet, bathrooms, toilets, and a private yard on both sides. It was just that she wanted a much larger yard, so she could have her private gardens and experimental fields close to home. This was pretty much a basic requirement for her house, which all her family members were very kind to always provide her with. But obviously, since she wanted to hide her status, she couldn't live too differently. But at the same time, she didn't want to wrong herself in the slightest. Thinking for a bit, she opened the map again and looked at the rough image of the territory. Her eyes zoned in on the other side of the territory, and her feet moved towards it. Without saying anything, they walked several minutes to the other half of the territory, near the northeast side where the farms would be zoned. She stared at the area for a while and mused that she, a botanist, was very fond of plants. A few square meters of land really would not be able to handle her requirements. Hence, in addition to the farms, she decided to make villas with large lots she could use to farm, a farm villa, so to speak. She then set up the avenue heading towards the east gate, with the same specifications as the southeast avenue, knowing full well this part would be no less developed than that one. She then set up minor roads that would lead to the farm villa area. This farm villa area would be located on a parallel street to the main eastern road. On the other side, they would be separated to the actual farms by orchards, coming soon. She looked at the map and finalized the preliminary locations of the agricultural zone, as well as the industrial zone, which would be further eastward near the new gate. She might be thinking too far ahead of herself, but placing the factories near the gates would also facilitate trade. Should she be partnering with other territories? For farmhouse villas, she directly put 2 modules together and took down the partition walls. She also added verandas, balconies, and other features. She then added a level 2 wall around its perimeter. She made 2 more of the exact same sets next to hers. All these 3 houses would have system farms on them, so the cost was quite high. Of course, the selling and rental fees would also be very beautiful. The total cost of the whole thing was several hundred silver coins, about 8 gold. As for the price, she decided to sell it for 100. For rent, it was a bit more expensive than the other building types, but it would be a self-sustaining property that would be quite profitable if used correctly. She added about 10 more farmlands in the agricultural zone to either be rented out privately or leased by tenant farmers. She was planning on occupying 1 or 2 for her experimental crops. While she did so, the others gathered resources on the way, adding to her quickly dwindling resources, even if only a little. Satisfied with what she had done, the group finally went on to a well-deserved break. They set up a picnic table under one of the trees near her future home, chatting and eating snacks. A few hours later, successive dings sounded inside her head. Ding, congratulations, weaponry store, LV1 has been completed. Ding, congratulations, custom building 8 has been completed. Ding, congratulations, custom building 9 has been completed. Congratulations, warehouse, LV1 has been completed. Congratulations, village center, LV1 has been completed. Ding, congratulations, custom building 10 has been completed. Ding, congratulations, custom building 11 has been completed. Ding, congratulations, custom building 12 has been completed. About an hour later, the farm villa they chose was finally erected, and they settled in before the sun set. It was dark, and they only had their solar-powered flashlight for decent illumination, and they decided to sleep in the living area for now. There weren't any furniture anyway. Turning off the light, they laid down their heads, and an unprecedented sense of peace came over them. After all, they finally settled down. They finally have a home. They arranged their sleeping bags side by side, looking at the ceiling above, and after turning off the lights, everything was now solely illuminated by the 2 moons of contrasting colors. Incredibly peaceful, the atmosphere calling for someone to open up emotional wounds. "Thank you," Eugene said out of nowhere, and everyone tilted their heads to his direction. "I would not be alive if it weren't for you," he said, and with his passion for creating reignited, he finally had a new reason to live. "So, thank you." The others smiled. Sheila couldn't help but look outside the translucent window. It would be great if there were more people. Now, all these buildings are done, but there's only 7 of us. The gold isn't a problem yet, but the resources are really lacking. We need more manpower, Althea said, and she supported herself up with an arm. "Any ideas on how to immediately attract new people?" she asked. After all, not many people would go into the mountains rather than look for flat lands. There was silence for a while, each one thinking of a way to attract people efficiently and safely, and without revealing, they had the Lord in the group. After a few minutes of silence, Eugene spoke up. "I may have an idea." Chapter 73, Fireworks Part 1. Several kilometers from the territory, a bloody scuffle was ongoing and reaching its peak. "Don't go there, damn it," a pudgy and dirty man yelled at his companion, who in his panic ended up running to the mouth of a monster instead of running away from it. The man blinked and turned his head, and it was the last time he'd be able to do so. Splack! It was night, and only the 2 moons partially covered by the dense foliage and a dimming flashlight were their only sources of illumination. They couldn't see what happened, but the gruesome sound of biting and chewing made everyone shake in fear. Baron and the others were pale, but didn't have the time to mourn the loss of yet another companion. "Distract it," he ordered his cousin, a buff woman named Bianca, as he looked at the monster they have been handling together. They needed to end this one urgently, because there was another monster was without an enemy, and it meant someone would deal with 2. Bianca nodded, and she ran in another direction, hitting the monster as she moved. The monster, a 1-meter-tall monster with 3 ugly eyes, saber tooth, and 3 legs, changed its target and faced her. Baron quickly took his remaining iron stick, and with all his strength stabbed the monster on its few vulnerabilities, the skin right under its 5th rib, something that they had discovered after the same monster killed their 6th companion. Killed, Tripial LV2, plus 50 experience plus 50 copper coins. They worked together beyond their capacity to deal with the remaining monsters. Some kicked, some hit, and some even used their own bodies to bump into it in desperation. Sometimes it worked, most of the times it didn't, because it was as dark and they were weak, and these damned monsters had very thick skins. After a few more losses, they were finally left with 1, but in exchange, everyone was nearly emptied and incredibly weak. With a wave of its strong arms, the remaining monster hit 2 of their surviving companions, throwing them high in the air, bang, and making them hit a tree and a rock, respectively. These companions lost consciousness the moment they touched the surfaces, leaving the 2 cousins behind to deal with it. Fortunately, it was already sufficiently weakened, and although they lost a few pints of blood, they still managed to hit its weak spots constantly, bleeding it to death. This time, he let Bianca have the final shot. Killed, Tripial LV2, plus 50 experience plus 50 copper coins. When they saw it fall down dead, their legs lost strength and they both fell down to the ground, unable to move anymore. Baron tried to raise his flabby arms, but it was too heavy. With a huff, he looked at the corpses of monsters and humans around them. He saw that Bianca was sobbing, and the other surviving companions that had their consciousness were lifelessly just staring at the trees. Baron knew one thing: if more monsters were to be attracted by all this blood, then it would be their end. As if sensing his fears, they soon heard rustles of leaves, and they were getting closer. It was followed by low growls that they could only associate with death. Baron paled, as if he lost all the remaining blood he had on him. Were they going to die here? How hard they fought for their lives back in Terran. In the end, would their lives end in this damned foreign land? No. They fought so hard, wasn't it just to survive? Wake up, stand up, damn it, he yelled. He recalled when his company was having a year-end party, and he had to make a speech with a broken mic. His vocal cords had never been so abused as it was now. Only a few companions managed to stand up, the rest either losing hope and giving up, while some simply couldn't wake up in time. But thankfully, most of his cousins and friends were among the ones who stood up, with the other ones lost very early on. While sad for the others who got transferred with them, he was already satisfied with this. They took out their weapons to deal with the new monsters. They were only as small as their knees, but there were a few, and their sharp teeth were definitely no joke. The damned things ran to their other surviving companions that couldn't stand anymore, and they tore apart their skins without effort. The constant sound of skin tearing off like paper torn off a book echoed in their ears, and they could only defend themselves to the best of their means. They were almost at the end of the line, losing hope, when a loud noise came above them. It wasn't only noise, but also a bright flash of light, sending hope to their souls. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Is that a firework? The noise was enough to keep the monster's attention away from the meat at hand, even for a second, but his quick-thinking partner, Jules, quickly dragged everyone to run away, pushing them to go towards the fireworks. They ran, even when they felt their legs were so painful it felt like they were falling off their torsos. They ran. My spirit, it's less than 50. Ah, my flashlight, that was their last one. Hurry up. Baron was a bit blessed in the horizontal direction, and was a bit slower. A monster opened its huge mouth to glomp on him, and he missed it by a hair's breadth. He felt his soul leave his body right then and there. The added adrenaline went to his legs, and allowed him to zoom forward, successfully adding distance between him and the man-eating rat behind. He even manifested some silver and gold, throwing it at the damned things, but it was either ignored or didn't do any sort of damage at all. Damn it, what use are all these gold when I'm gonna die anyway? He screamed, darting forward to the best of his limited ability. I should have hoarded bazookas. Chapter 74, Fireworks Part 2. Cassie, wearing a miner's hat, lit up the way as she cleared a path for her grandmother. She was holding a wooden sword on one hand, and her grandmother was gripping on her trusted cooking pan. Grandma, come on, she yelled, and instinctively raised the sword, and it met the sharp teeth of a monster. Grandma quickly hit the monster with her pan, and Cassie took advantage and shifted the angle so that the broken sword would enter its mouth, and she pushed her body forward to reach its brain. Thankfully, it was only a level 1 monster, and Cassie, who was already at level 2, managed to deal with it, though barely because one wooden sword was usually done after 1 or 2 monsters. Killed Nomos LV1, plus 30 copper, plus 30 experience. She was an Olympic champion in Kendo back in her youth, and she loved it so much she never stopped doing it, even when she didn't participate in contests anymore. She was extremely thankful for her perseverance, otherwise, she and her grandmother wouldn't have lived so long. She took out yet another wooden sword and heaved a sigh. She had relied on her dozens and dozens of swords to survive with her grandma until now. However, the monsters here had very thick skins, and it was getting more and more difficult to deal with them. She was on her last wooden sword. If it broke, what would she do? Get some twigs? It was here that she heard a noise from a direction, and her eyes brightened at the sight. Grandma narrowed her bad eyes, thinking she must have been seeing things. Are those? It's fireworks, Cassie exclaimed, grabbing the older woman's hand. Let's go. Follow it, a group of young men and women shakily used the last batteries of their final flashlight to light up their way. They were filled with blood and grime, and they laboriously dragged their feet to follow the light. They have been in this hellhole for a few days now, and they had never thought they'd ever go through such suffering in their whole lives. They were in so much pain with all the wounds that covered their bodies, and it felt like all their appendages were about to fall off in tiredness. They were also parched and hungry and weak, and it was just so horrible. They had long lost the food and water that they had on them. Although there was food in the forest, they didn't know which one was poisonous and could kill them the next second. They lost exactly 2.5 companions from poison. The person counted as half because in his half-dead state, he was desperate and ate the nearest most delicious-looking food beside him. At least in Terran, even if there were zombies, there was still a lot of food. Not to mention, zombies tended to lose their heads if they swung an axe with their supposedly increased physique, not like the monsters here, where the same axe would be bitten to pieces. Zombies had become adorable and worthy of their longing. Troy scrunched his flat nose in regret. If I knew we'd get thrown here, I'd have ran home to get my collection. Troy was an ancient weapons enthusiast. Hot weapons couldn't be owned privately, but his collection was just the right amount of coolness and the right amount of legal. Unfortunately, they were far from home when the disaster happened. Of course, their distance from civilization also allowed their group, who didn't turn to zombies, to all survive in those 24 hours. It was just that they easily lost a third the moment they got migrated. They were a group of childhood friends and cousins gathered together for a wildlife bonfire party. It was supposed to be a super fun activity, but who knew how it would end up halfway through. They were, ironically, telling horror stories when they suddenly fainted, and half of them suddenly started moving creepily and biting at their seat mates. They witnessed a girlfriend eating her boyfriend and a brother mauling his sister. They saw them eating their insides, chewing on intestines. All of them vomited out what they ate that night, and days later, when they already consumed all their food, they felt so hungry that they regretted not being able to control their bile. What a waste! Anyway, they were still lucky enough to have camping gears when the disaster happened, but it had been so many days, and they were in their last resources. Even the last bit of lighting they had was this flashlight, and it was already flickering. However, that firework still managed up their way, telling them a direction to target, even if it only lasted for a second. In fact, it was not much of a firework. It was very small and didn't even last more than a second. But that little spark lit up hope in them like a raging fire. There were many such groups around the area, following the light with renewed strength to defend themselves from the mobs that they encountered. The group of youngsters ran in the direction where the light was last seen, with renewed energy. Fred, who had been holding the compass, led the way, his freckled face covered with grime and sweat, but eyes filled with brightness as bright as his orange hair. Raw shit. Just run for your lives. Your lives literally depends on it, damn it. They ran and they ran, until Fred saw a glimpse of stone amidst the forests. Almost there, guys, guo. And they darted, with energy they didn't know they still had. Unfortunately. Flop, a sound of a body falling down and made their hearts drop. Brother. It's Lulu. Troy quickly went about face to run back to his cousin, but it was too late, the monster was too close. Tears began to form as he tried to go to her anyway. But before it could take a bite at his cousin, a fast arrow flashed, hitting the monster right on the head, killing it. It wasn't the only one, more mobs arrived and, as long as they were within a certain area, arrows would fly by themselves, attacking the monsters. Troy's eyes widened and he whipped his head to the direction of arrows. They were towers placed roughly every 100 meters. Sentries, he yelled, and he grabbed his fallen cousin and held her up. The small group of youngsters quickly ran to the gate, but no longer panicked, knowing in their hearts that they were being protected. They felt like they breathed in a new life when a notification appeared. Welcome to Althea Village. Chapter 75, Rescue. Althea. Althea and the others watched as the small fireworks lit up the sky with mixed emotions. It really wasn't much, as she didn't have much waste guns and gunpowder, but it was enough to alert the survivors. It was really short though, I hope a lot of people saw it. Sheila mumbled, looking at the now dark sky with worry. There should be, Eugene said, considering that other than the moon, there are no other sources of light at this time. The contrast would be enough for at least a few groups to see. There will also be monsters, however, Eugene added, looking at Althea with apprehension. She looked at them, nonchalant about this issue. As for the monsters that it would attract, the expensive sentry towers should be able to deal with them. Let's trust my very expensive defense system, was all she said, very vaguely. I also want to see the sentry towers at work, Sheila mumbled, looking very curious. Althea blinked, looking at them. Then why don't you take advantage of them and train? The trio simultaneously turned to look at her, suddenly enlightened. As such, everyone, along with Maya and Fufi, actually decided to go out and train a bit. Maybe they could even rescue a few people on the way. As for Althea, pregnancy lethargy already attacked, so she was already in bed, in a bedroom this time, because it was weird to sleep alone in the living room. As she laid down her duvet, she began chatting leisurely with her Barbies, just before drifting to sleep. 500 meters from the walls. Are you sure this is the right way? Baron asked, panting, his flabby belly bouncing as he darted forward with all his might. He pressed his chest and his kidney to ease the discomfort. They were getting painful from all the excess running. Didn't I tell you I was awarded the, Bianca breathed in, lacking air, best Girl Scout for 3 years straight? Bianca said so with a lot of pride, even as she was gasping for breath, offended that she was being questioned. Baron rolled his eyes. Yes, of course, he remembered. Her mother never stopped bragging about it to his mother. But he couldn't even make a snide response because he was too tired, and his legs were heavy as lead. He couldn't help but look behind as he ran, and his heart dropped at how close the small mob was. They even increased in number. Damn it! Their small group went beyond their limits to escape, hopping to finally reach a safe place. But they were humans, and no matter what, their bodies would reach their absolute maximum limit in the end. Baron could feel he was nearing his. But someone yelled words that made him go even farther. I see it, there's a wall. It's a wall. The group sprinted in the direction, no longer caring if they lost their legs in the process. However, a monster suddenly sprinted and extended its arms. His cousin was nicked by a claw directly at her back. Ah. Bianca. I'm fine, just run. Bianca gritted her teeth and pushed on. It was as if she wasn't bleeding heavily at all. However, there was an undergrowth that Baron was unable to avoid, and he lost his balance, precisely 120 meters from the wall. He felt like he lost all remaining blood in despair. It's not on a node. He tried to crawl, no longer able to feel his legs. His companions had sprinted forward with their entire beings, not noticing someone was left behind. He could hear the monster closing in, its mouth, its breath, and Baron thought it was his end. But a moment later he heard a swish sound and a figure running to him. It was dark and wasn't clear, but he knew it was approaching him at super speed, and it had sharp teeth, saliva illuminated by the moonlight. It was definitely a monster, and they were coming at him from both directions. Baron cried and sobbed, snot dripping non-stop, hopeless. He was so close. I don't want to die, he sobbed, expecting to be mauled a moment later. But the new beast suddenly leaped past him, jumping over his plump body and using it as a springboard. Oof, he uttered out, and he quickly heard a scuffle behind him. Then there was the swish sound of metal and more noise. Hey, stand up, someone yelled, and he blinked, tilting his head to see an old man waving an axe around with a dog right next to him. It was only now did he realize that the new figure was no monster, but a furry friend. A dog? Are you just going to lie there or not? Another voice, a woman's, sounded. She was a bit far from them, and she was holding a bow and arrow. He saw an angel right there. And the angel glared at him in annoyance, making him flinch. Yes. But there was no way, his legs didn't have strength, and he just fell down again. He heard an exasperated sigh next to him, and the next thing he knew, he was being carried. From his side, he could see the woman shooting arrows as they ran. She wasn't very good, but he thought it was the most beautiful thing. He looked back to see the dog grappling with another monster, finally killing it by biting its neck. It then lost its scary face and returned to a normal-looking dog, if you ignore the blood dripping from his mouth, and is that a piece of flesh, following closely behind them. He could only gape as he was carried nearer the wall, where his companions were. They were worried but safe, and they obviously wanted to get back to him. They were being stopped by someone, a man with stick legs obviously sticking out of his pants, and a little girl, from going to him, and they stood over an invisible demarcating line. "Cousin! Hurry!" He saw the stick-leg man was also holding a bow and arrow, but was markedly more skilled than the girl. Two people had bows and arrows, hitting monsters that were getting too close to them. And when they went past some sort of threshold, a few sharp wheezes passed by over their heads, and the next thing they knew, all the monsters following them dropped dead. He then felt weightless, and he hit the ground soon after. "Harold huffed, you're very heavy," he said after dropping him and walking to the little girl and patting her head. Of course, Baron was not insulted. Instead, he dragged himself to face the rescuers. Thank you, he said, bowing to them. If he could feel his legs, he'd kowtow to them. His companions also bowed, sobbing, barely standing themselves. The girl, now looking calmer than before, smiled at them. It wasn't so much, it was the sentries that did most work. They looked at the dignified-looking wall and sentry towers, their hearts filled with relief and joy. But still, thank you. This time it was Bianca. To his surprise, she was no longer bleeding. We owe you our lives. It's really nothing. Just continue walking this way, she said, pointing at the 11 o'clock direction. You will be able to find the gate. Seeing that the woman really didn't want to deal with them anymore, they only bowed once more and finally headed to the direction. Thank you so much, they yelled sincerely with all their hearts. Sheila and the others were embarrassed and only smiled. They would end up rescuing a dozen people before going to bed, very proud of themselves. Chapter 76, People Tab. On the other hand, while the citizens slept soundly, the Lord was not. She was shifting in her sleep, drenched with sweat. Abruptly, she opened her eyes and sat up, a few tears lining up her eyes. She dreamed of her husband. She dreamed of him fighting for his life and protecting his team. She dreamed of him looking out the two moons, hopping to see her again, desperately fighting to get back home, to her. Only to find that the home they knew was no more. When she opened her eyes were wet with tears. She sighed as she sat up, subconsciously patting her stomach, an instinctive act when she longed for comfort. He didn't even know he had children yet, didn't he? Although he didn't seem to like children, or most people in general, she could still recall him meticulously taking care of her even at the age where boys simply wanted to go out and play. He also took care of Ansel a lot, training him and making sure he wouldn't get bullied. Althea thought he would definitely be a great father. She shook her head of the thought. There was nothing she could do for Garin except build him a new home, something that they as orphans had an integral need for. With this thought, she smiled and looked down at her protruding stomach. Good morning, she said. Let's take a look at the changes in the territory, okay? I bet they're good. Territory stats. Area, 3,142,000 square meters. Residents, 31, 10 permanent, 21 temporary. Total population, 53. Base resources. Wood, 25,000. Stone, 53,000. Money, 76 gold, 91,767 silver, 27,987 copper. Reputation, 3. Buildings, Village Center, LV1, Weaponry Shop, LV1, Defensive Wall, LV3, Warehouse, LV1, Farm, LV1. Bonus Building, Custom Building. Building slots, 5+1. She looked at the increase of reputation in interest. How did it get calculated? However, because she didn't know what it was for yet, her interest dwindled quickly. Instead, what caught her attention was her severely lacking resources. Even if she had plenty of gold, it seemed she wouldn't be able to do much more at this point. However, with more people would gather resources for her, so she wasn't very worried. What surprised her was the fact that she had 3 new permanent residents. Her fee for this type of residency was not cheap. She was already planning out the alternative methods for her future residents to pay for it because the price was prohibitive. For instance, merit, for instance, contributions. But look, one night and she had 3. She then opened her territory window, and chose the never-before-touched tab, People. Soon a list of 53 names appeared on her screen. Next to their names was their loyalty to the territory. In her own party, except for Eugene, who had 95%, the rest had 100%. This was not surprising. What surprised her was the rest of the people. Outside of their team had pretty good loyalties as well, at least 60%. There were even as high as 80%. Was such loyalty the default? How was Althea to know that these people had lost hope the previous night, and the light of guidance the territory released saved them all? How could they not have even a bit of goodwill? The next column was their level, then their professions, citizenship, elemental affinity, and overall potential. She could even see their net worth. Althea paused. What an intrusive access panel. She shrugged in the end, though, as she wouldn't abuse this feature too much, at least not to the detriment of the individual. With this comforting thought, she resumed in exploring this function of the Lord panel. She began to take a look at the professions. She was the only one who had something listed there. Pharmacist, archer. She had totally forgotten about this. She ignored this for now and shifted back to the list. She realized that the list could be arranged in decreasing or increasing order of the category needed for convenience. As she perused the list, Althea found some interesting figures. For example, arranging by potential, Sheila's B level was really above average. In the 53 people, there were a few BS and even an A, the rest were CS or DS. For example, someone actually had 624 gold in hand, a bit more, and he could have had his own territory. For example, this same person bought the other 2 villas next to her. That was, 200 gold from the get-go. A little more, and this guy really could have had his own lord token. Then she looked at his C potential and corrected herself. After all, only people at B level could get a token. Anyway, if she could change the names and add nicknames, she would put Golden Goose on this guy. It was also worth noting that everyone had the so-called elemental affinity, whatever it meant. So far there was no indication of what this was, but it definitely meant something. She really hoped there was an FAQ section somewhere. Another thing she noticed about this particular attribute was that everyone else only had one element. Sheila had water, Harold and Maya had earth, and Eugene had the rare metal affinity, wherein he was one of the 2 people among the 53 to have it. The most common one so far was earth and fire, comprising more than half of the population together. For now, she knew there was at least 6 elements: wood, water, fire, earth, wind, and metal. As for the others, there may be some out there, but they hadn't reached her land just yet. Thinking about it, if asked, she decided to just say she had wood affinity. 3 was really too much. She hoped to see someone with at least dual elements, though she had no idea what it was for yet. Putting this aside for now, she continued to look at the winnings from last night. Seeing that there were 53 people, it meant that she must have attracted a lot of mobs. The sentry towers were reliable enough that a few intermittent groups of low-level monsters were no threat at all. The best thing was that the loot, no experience, unfortunately, of sentry towers automatically went right into her pocket, evident in the thousands of copper coins added to her wallet. Although she lost a bit of wood, the resources that she made in her sleep are satisfying. Better only a bit of damage was done to the walls, that it didn't even register as 1%. Sentry towers were too worth it. She stretched and stood up, looking forward to meeting her new citizens. Chapter 77, Housewarming, Part 1. Aberdeen City, 16 years prior. Little Althea looked around her new room in awe. It was very cute, even bigger than the dormitory room she shared with 4 other girls. It had pink walls, a large bed, a table so she could draw and study, and a play space with toys. So many toys. She counted, and there were 14 stuffed toys. 14. And Mom and Dad, when they showed it to her earlier, told her she had it all for herself. She turned her little head to look up at the young Garen, who had been watching her reaction. She grinned, and her feet patted in his direction, opening her arms to his arms. "Is it our new home?" she asked Garen, who embraced her back, who was feeling sad that it took her so long to find one. He said after a while. "Yes, you can now eat all the delicious food you want until you're full." He paused, apprehensive she'd eat too much and hurt herself. "As long as it's healthy." he said, touching her tummy without baby fat, not like the other kids, and his heart broke, or else you'd have a tummy ache. Okay, she said as she hugged him. She couldn't help but notice how her feet felt the boards warm, unlike the cold tiles of the orphanage. So warm. Garen smiled. It was now in the middle of fall, and the weather had long gotten colder. They were just too used to the cold and adapted that she didn't realize the warmth sooner. It'll be warm, even in winter. She lifted her head to look at him in awe. We won't get cold in winter anymore. He smiled, a little heartbroken, and nodded. Tilda, she mumbled, burying her little head in his arms. How nice. Altera village, present. As soon as they woke up, the residents of the house except Althea, who was still sleeping rather deeply, had been walking around their new house to see more of their new home. After all, it was already dark when they settled, and they could barely appreciate a thing. The total floor area of each floor, combining the floor space of 2 modules, was about 240 square meters, not including the added verandas and balconies strategically added outside certain fenestrations. Eugene explained that it was to maximize natural ventilation and shade. He even went on to the details, something like temperature siphoning, etc., which more or less passed by their heads. However, he did look like he was really enjoying leading them on this little tour around the house. The coffee-skinned man was very much unlike his depressed self a few days prior, and it could be seen he really liked what he's been doing for the territory. I thought you were a mechanical engineer. I wanted to be an architect too, but I couldn't draw very well. Although they could use programs to draw now, there was something special about drawing freehand. In that aspect, Althea was far superior. He had seen her notebook of plants, and it was admirable. Harold just smiled and continued asking questions about the house, which Eugene gladly answered. The group tacitly decided to live together, though it was mostly because they hoped to take care of Althea. Their pregnant boss would be due soon after all, as constantly reminded by Sheila. If she didn't remind them, everyone, including the pregnant woman herself, would all forget. Anyway, the house was huge with several rooms per floor. They would just make sure to work well to help her out with whatever she needed, so they wouldn't feel like freeloaders. The interior of the house was mostly wood, though different types of it, adding liveliness to the design. The surface and open plan arrangement was pretty quaint and had a relaxing quality to it. They liked it very much. They left most of the first floor to Althea. She would have her own bedroom, a study, and another room as her workshop. One of the last rooms would temporarily be Eugene's workshop, while the remaining one was a storage space for their materials and inventions. The basement, on the other hand, would be the cellar where their food stocks were placed. As for the second floor, they decided to combine 2 rooms to create 2 dormitory rooms instead. Althea was so charming, who knew how many minions would willingly follow her. Sure, they could buy more houses, but people would definitely want to live as close as they could. Anyway, 4-bedroom dormitories with ample spaces wasn't bad at all. Unlike the boss, they were poor, weak-hearted people who wouldn't want to live alone in a room after living in nightmarish worlds in succession. Who knew if they'd have nightmares in their sleep and never wake up, having other people in the bedroom provided some comfort. Not to mention, this was a large dormitory, and they had plenty of space for their own study, wardrobe, etc. Then they furtively walked outside, and they saw the entirety of the house. The facade was mostly wood, and the fenestrations were also wooden slats, but there was notably a slab of translucent material attached. It was peach in color, and it allowed light to naturally come in while properly protecting privacy. Cappies, Harold mumbled, finding the material a bit familiar, as he had worked at an island restaurant before. Eugene nodded, not exactly but very similar. However, it's good enough for now since we don't have glass, he said. We also added it around some torches, to replace glass to some degree, even inside the house. They then moved forward to see more details around the structure. The columns were clad with darker-colored wood to accent the lines, making the structure appear even more stable. Another notable feature was the entire ground floor was made of stone walls. It was non-homogeneous and had different visible aggregates of the stones used, adding quaintness to the entire thing. This was basically a wood-stone house, and it combined the warmth of wood with the sturdiness of stone. They found it to be very charming. Eugene explained that it was to deal with the currently unknown climate systems in this world. After all, they were completely unfamiliar with this world and its weather, so he and Althea designed for everything they could think of and research about. It was quite costly and complicated, but it was better safe than sorry. There was also the peace of mind it provided, which made all this already worth it. And indeed, this early consideration would eventually save a lot of lives. Chapter 78, Housewarming Part 2. Very stable, Harold said, and Eugene proudly added. This stone wall would not only add stability, but also insulation. He said, in addition, the wooden upper floors are light in case of earthquakes, in which case heavier upper floors may be much more dangerous than their alternatives. As for how they connected the two floors, various techniques were used like supporting posts and beams, corbelling, wall tie-ins, and the like. There were even flexible joints that would allow the structure to accommodate movements, even if it was just due to change in temperature and humidity. They shouldn't relax because the current climate was temperate. They didn't know what seasons there were in here. Generally, stone was stronger, but it wasn't ideal for earthquake-prone areas. Although the structural members were made with similar material to concrete, they didn't want to risk it. There was also the variable of stronger gravity. For the concrete-like item, they replaced the rebars with a tensile fiber called flue, which was a byproduct from the lauge, the poisonous plant Boss found during one of her adventures. The Boss was very talkative when it came to plants, and she rambled on and on about how she accidentally figured it out when she got poisoned before, and almost got poisoned again with her experiments. Of course, this byproduct was no longer poisonous, nor will it have any hazardous effect on the inhabitants. It was not like the concrete they knew, but it was close enough for now. If they could find a stable source of lime, then naturally they would use it. The amount of things they could accomplish with legitimate concrete was immeasurable. Anyway, they had a river nearby, so it shouldn't be too far in the future. On the other hand, for the windows, they used something called the Yuli stone. It was amusingly dug up by Fufi when he was digging a hole to bury a bone. It was a stone that could be used like cappies, which was a decent alternative to glass in their current situation. For now, it could be used instead of glass walls and windows, adding translucency inside the house while retaining the necessary privacy of a home. It was also fire-resistant, allowing torches to be placed inside a house safely. Fortunately, Boss already had a rough concept in her mind and studied materials, otherwise they wouldn't have taken just half a day to design such a module. He and the Boss had a long discussion and even had low-key arguments about them. These windows and other aspects of the house could also be covered appropriately in case winter came, though otherwise it worked better for tropical hot climates. The house had a harmonious blend of elegance and stability, with the solid structure on the ground anchoring everything to the ground, while the upper level seemed to float gracefully above it. The roofing also had large eaves to provide better protection for the ones below, and its corners a little curved to make it look lighter. The roofs were also made of tile-like things, which was amazing because there was no kiln. It was nothing like they've seen before, not in their century. It was quite lovely. Eugene actually underestimated the effect. Beauty and versatility were the primary reasons why their buildings would definitely have a unique look amongst other territories. This architectural style would be one of Althera's defining features in the future. Althea walked out her room and saw that the others, except for the children who were still sleeping, had already set up the pot. Even if they had a house with a kitchen, because there wasn't furniture, they still had to eat as if they were in the wilderness, albeit much more comfortable. It was Sheila who felt pity for the beauty who had to sit on the floor. It was blasphemy to make their boss fairy sit on the floor inside a perfectly good house. If only there were a furniture store. Harold nodded. They could pretty much handle themselves, but furnishings were really a must. The kitchen is nice, but there's no cooking tool. They still had to use the portable pots and grills in the end. I would love some duvet pillow and the likes as well, Eugene mumbled beside them. Because he had no muscles below or legs in general, the forces on his thigh could really strain him. Looking at her companions sighing at the same time, Althea also remembered that she only slept well because her sleeping bag was high quality. No matter what, it was weird to use a sleeping bag in your own bedroom. Thinking of this, she decided to look into her Lord tab to see if she could remotely control the village center and its other functions. Sure enough, upon clicking the logo, a plethora of options lit up her screen. She clicked on the village center and a screen floated up in front of her, showing several buttons. One was an inquiry window, a purchase window, a missions window, and the announcement window. Clicking the announcement window, she saw a text box, as well as some options for voice and font. There was also the option of announcing only to residents, permanent and/or temporary, as well as an announcement to everyone in the territory. The latter, unsurprisingly, with added costs. Directly choosing robotic and the most standard font, she began to type out her first announcement. A minute later, every resident in the territory heard a ding in their ears. Welcome to all residents. In order to immediately revitalize the lifestyle and economy of the territory, the system has decided to place 3-month discounts to a set number of residents who wish to rent a commercial space. Preferred stores are food, beverages, furniture, tools, medicine stores. Please head to the village center for more information. The others around the circle flinched, looked at each other, and then stared at Althea, who they realized was probably behind the announcement. Harold and Sheila, for cover, it's best for you to appear in the village center in the guise of applying to rent a commercial space. They nodded in understanding, though they couldn't help but ask, system. Yes, I thought I can communicate with the citizens this way. It's very convenient. Can we hide that there's a lord in the territory with this? Maybe everyone's a newbie in this world. Who's to say there aren't ownerless territories? They nodded in understanding and looked forward to the new shops that would pop out of this, what new items would finally be available to them. How many restaurants, tool shops would come out? But whatever it was, everyone looked at each other with glint in their eyes. They would carve out this home for themselves, definitely. Chapter 79, First House Visit. As they were eating their amply seasoned breakfast noodles deliciously, they heard the scuffles upstairs and soon saw the little heads peeking down from upstairs. They looked adorable with their half-dazed eyes, poking their heads down and trying to see what the adults were up to. Both Harold and Eugene stood up to take the children and guided them in the circle for breakfast. It was just that Theodore was a little big man and didn't want to get carried anymore. After all, Sister Maya was just a teeny bit older, but she didn't get carried around. Seeing him struggle, Eugene then let him down as soon as they got to the lowest step of the stairs. He immediately ran to where the center of activity was food, and his feet pitter-pattered on his way there. It was just that as he ran to the pot, he missed a step and tripped. Thud! Oh no, Theo, Sheila exclaimed, and the adults quickly stood up to assist him. It was Eugene who got to him first, gently patting non-existent dust on his little pants and patting his head to comfort him. There were tears lined up in his cute big eyes, but even if a few bits of tears fell, he did not make a sound. The sight itself was heartbreaking. Althea quickly lifted the little ball to her lap, gently wiping his tears. You are so well behaved, you don't even cry. The mocha-colored child still hadn't spoken after all this time. They mused that he may have been traumatized by his mother's death to the point that he became a mute. She felt pity for the little boy, and her motherly heart softened to mush. It was around here that her own little balls got active and started kicking. Theodore felt it and he gaped at her stomach, tentatively touching the protruding stomach, which promptly moved again. His little mouth made a little O of wonder, and his sadness was quickly swept away. His big eyes filled with curiosity and glee as he stared at her stomach. It was adorable. That's your little sister and your little brother, she said, gently rubbing his copper-colored chubby cheeks. They will come out to play with you very soon. Theodore opened his mouth as if wanting to say something, but he closed his mouth again just as quickly. Althea's eyebrows rose, interested, but before she could ask, there was a knock on the door. Everyone looked at each other in wonder. They had been alone for so long, it seemed like a door knocking felt strange. They seemed to have a visitor. When Harold opened the gate, what met him was the ingratiating smile of a plump man. It was still an acquaintance they just met the night prior. He seemed to be in his early 30s, and he was very much cleaned up, very different from what he looked like the night before, wherein he was grimy, slimy, haggard, and with a face full of snot and tears. Anyway, the man's current smile was so wide that Harold was taken aback. Hello, we have just mov. Then the man saw him and gaped. Benefactor. Oh, hi. Good morning, I didn't know you lived here. What a wonderful coincidence. I was just about to look for you. Okay. I was one of the people you rescued last night. He continued to bawl, "Now that I see you, I would like to express my gratitude on behalf of the team." He then very graciously manifested 50 gold. Harold gaped, but he raised his hand in surrender, afraid that the gold would be handed over to him. This is too much. We really didn't do much." "I insist," Baron smiled, grabbed his raised hand, and handed the money to him anyway. He tentatively looked behind Harold, hoping to see another face. "I also hope to give some to the woman who rescued me with you." "You mean Sheila?" Sheila," he mused dreamily. "What a beautiful name." He didn't know he was making a creepy face, and Harold could not say anything without being rude, so the old man simply stayed silent. Some of his teammates behind him, kindly, poked his back to pull him back to the present. He turned to glare at them, but they pointed at the house owners in front instead. It was only here that Baron finally realized that he scared the other man, and he extended his hand to introduce himself. He cleared his throat and gathered himself like a gentleman. "My name is Baron Smith. I bought the house next door. This is my cousins Angelo Smith and Jesse Pugh," he said, introducing the two young men beside him. "While we were walking along the neighborhood to try and find you guys, in fact, we couldn't help but be attracted by a fabulous scent," he said, with special emphasis on the word fabulous. "I know it could be too much to ask, but can we perhaps buy a few bowls from you? I am willing to pay," he said, and took out yet a couple more gold. Harold blinked but did not agree immediately. "I'll ask my boss," he said, and ran inside after gently closing the gate. "Excuse me." Althea's eyebrows raised at this. This was the guy who had the most gold next to her. While they really wouldn't charge that much, it definitely wouldn't be cheap. And yet this guy was willing to buy a few bowls of noodles for so much gold. Golden goose indeed. Outside the fence, the trio waited for the response, eyes staying on the now closed gate. They looked patient, but their stomachs were already rumbling. In fact, it wasn't that Baron was the stupid rich type. He himself was a businessman, and he was known to be a bit of a shrewd one. It was just that people who could eat well after so long and rent, or buy, a villa so soon must have abilities and was worth befriending. Not to mention that they lived next to each other, so their interactions was inevitable. And of course, most importantly, they were also his team's benefactors. Hence, a good relationship was a must. Also, perhaps they've been here longer than they did. They didn't have the time to explore the previous night. Maybe this group had information they needed. Anyway, just as he had an intuition to purchase the 2 remaining farm villas, he had the intuition to befriend this neighbor of his. And he was very correct at this. In the future, he couldn't help but worship the him at this moment. He was a genius. Chapter 80, New Neighbor. A few minutes passed by and Baron and the others could only study the surroundings while they waited. "Those are vines, right?" Angelo said, pointing at the stone fence. They turned to look at the 2-meter-high stone fence and the little sprouts that were already crawling up. It had already reached about half a meter up the fence. "They definitely got here a lot longer than we did, at least a full day." Jesse analyzed. "We could get information from them." Baron scoffed, puffing his chest. "Of course we can, but as goodwill we must also give gifts." The chatter was cut when the man from before got out of the house and opened the gate. "Come in," he said, "but we won't charge so much, don't worry." "My name is Harold, by the way," he said, chatting as they walked along the paved road to the main door. "Nice to meet you, Harold," Baron said a bit absent-mindedly. He looked at the paved road and the obvious provision for a future garden. He could confirm this team was here more than a bit earlier than they were. The fact that they could also prepare for designing the house also said a lot about their personalities and abilities. After all, it showed an amazing mental fortitude to already be thinking about lifestyle after everything that had happened. "Did you also arrive yesterday?" "Yes, we were attracted by the fireworks," Harold told him without any flaws, "but we were fortunate that we were very near the source. It took less than an hour to find the wall." "So lucky," Baron said. "Did you encounter many people?" "Well," Harold nodded. Although they moved primarily along the east gate, he knew there were a lot more people on the southwestern side, so he could still say this with confidence. "There are denser housing arrangements from the other gate we went into." "Oh, yes, dormitories, I believe." Baron looked at his companions with raised eyebrows. "Interesting," he said, no doubt planning to visit these aforementioned dormitories very soon. It was at this time they reached the door and they entered the house. They saw a group of good-looking people surrounding an electric pot, which was currently exuding the most wonderful smell. The boy's eyes stayed on the pot, while Baron's gravitated immediately to the lovely Sheila, who was feeding an adorable little boy with mocha skin. Then he zoned in on another child, a little girl, and there also seemed to be a pregnant woman too. He wasn't able to see immediately as she was facing away from the door. This composition surprised him so much. This team was really something else to be able to protect such people conventionally believed to be dead weight. More than anything, this required heavy skill and resources. No wonder they had the energy to rescue them. "Hello, Miss Sheila," he exclaimed, sitting next to the woman, who was taken aback by his booming voice. He cleared his throat and tried to be gentle, making his two companions choke on their own saliva. He sent them a glare before his annoyed face morphed to gentleness, facing the woman of his dreams. "I would like to give my rescuers a little gift," he said, manifesting another 50 gold. The girl stared at him but didn't take it. "Please, this is what my whole team pooled together. We had to express our gratitude in some way. You saved our lives." He looked very sincere, he was, and Sheila had no choice but to take his gratitude. "Well, okay, I'll use this for the team," she said, and Harold nodded. "Same with me." Having the tact not to discuss last night again in a short while, they sat down to the free space given to them around the pot. They gaped as Harold took out a few more packs of noodles from his space. "It's amazing you still have so much," Jesse exclaimed, eyes sparkling with hunger. Harold instinctively leaned back to maintain his personal space. "It's all right, when we got here we mostly ate local materials." Baron, despite the constant enamored looks he sent to Sheila, was still sharp enough to hear important information. Local materials, like monster meat and plants. "Yes." Jesse made a face, seeming to remember something in the recent past. "Monster meats are so hard and tangy." "I have a pressure cooker," Harold said with a shrug and couldn't help adding, "it's solar-powered." "Fudge, what, why? Who would bring a pressure cooker during the apocalypse?" "I'm fond of cooking," Harold said as a matter of factly. The group looked at him strangely. Was this the legendary hardcore cooks are hardcore, and more importantly? "And how do you know which plant is poisonous?" Baron asked. How many of their initial companions fell because of eating something questionable, he couldn't count. Harold smiled proudly and turned his head in a direction. "Boss here specializes in plants." The men followed his sights and froze. Gaping at the beauty, Althea had been facing away from them so they couldn't see her clearly. Looking at them staring stupidly, Harold frowned. How rude. The men were pulled out of their trance and stared at both Harold and Althea with eager stares. "Can you teach us," Baron paused, "to determine which plants could be eaten, that is? How many people they saw died of eating the wrong thing, and how they starved because they didn't dare eat randomly?" Althea looked at them in interest. In fact, within the territory, no intrinsically poisonous item remained. Magically, when the territory was built, all these plants were moved outside the territory, which also meant there would be more poisonous plant per square meter right outside the territory than it was before. Althea smiled, patting her stomach. She nodded in agreement. "Well, within the territory I can show you which ones are edible. I will show you when I have the time." Anyway, the residents would be allowed to take a set amount of resources per person, enough for them to survive. This made their eyes brighten, and they looked at her like a goddess. They didn't take away their sight until the irresistible sight and aroma of the food went directly under their noses. Harold didn't want Boss Althea to feel uncomfortable with the stares of strangers, so he hurriedly handed the bowls of instant noodles to the three newcomers. Looking at the delicacy, their stomachs churned in greed. "Ahhhh, finally." No one spoke again after this, and they all ate to their heart's content. She earned a full 30 gold coins from this meal alone. Althea chuckled, golden goose indeed. Hello.